I would encourage you to still evaluate your company as if you were planning to sell it tomorrow, because who knows? We just don't know what tomorrow brings.
Everyone's business is a little bit different, specific towards the customer, but diversity in your revenue streams is huge. What type of buyers are out there for your business, and how are they going to assess your business? Having your financials, your attrition, your central station data all in line so that you're knowledgeable and prepared when you're ready to go to market.
It only takes one account to go bad for you to end up in court.
Buyers are going to look at, especially from an RMR perspective, is margins and cash flow. So, how your RMR is priced, and also is your RMR contracted.
Good morning and welcome to Coffee Break with Jake. We do this call every Friday at 11 a.m. I'm so glad that you're here. For those of you that may be tuning in for the first time, the purpose of this call is to bring together professionals from throughout the industry, throughout the country, and sometimes from around the world to share best practices, to discuss challenges, and to identify opportunities for growth and continuous improvement. Today, I'm really excited to talk to you, or really just to kind of moderate some conversation here about buying and selling alarm companies or other succession planning models. I'm really excited to be joined by Colby Monachino and Joe Monachino from Monachino Partners. And before we get started, if you would, Colby, if you just kind of introduce yourself and Monachino Partners.
Yeah, thanks, Jake, for having me. I'm looking forward to discussions today. I'm Colby Monachino. My older brother or father and business partner, Joe Monachino, is also on the call. So Monachino Partners, we're a full-service mergers and acquisitions firm that focuses on representing companies in the security, fire, life safety, and integration sectors. We offer brokerage and consulting services. We work with companies that are both looking to sell and looking to acquire. We work hands-on with our clients. So those that are looking to sell, we do a lot of upfront work, helping you get prepared and knowledgeable and ready to go to market. And on the buy side, we work hands-on as well. So we can help source deals for those that are looking to acquire. Joe and I started Monachino Partners a year and 4 months ago. Joe's been in the industry a long time, and both of us have an acquisition background. So, with that, we're able to be very helpful with companies that are looking to acquire. So not only can we help source deals, but we can manage the process from start to finish. So, through negotiations into LOIs, and then also managing the due diligence from start to finish. And then we can also be helpful as well with integration work post-close from a sale. On the consulting front, so for those that don't necessarily need a broker, but you're working through an acquisition and you need help on due diligence, we can manage due diligence. Like I said before, we have been doing a lot of work with companies and preparing them to sell. So if you're a year, 2 or 3 years out, we can work on a plan for you, give you a fair market analysis on your company, where values may range. And then we can also talk about areas to clean up so that when you're ready, you're prepared and can go to market. We have another full range of consulting services that we can offer. So like I said, we're full service, and we're here to help.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here. And Joe, did you want to add anything to that?
No, my brother did a great job filling in the pieces. I'm the old man with 45 years of experience. So we can get into that later.
Awesome. Well, so glad to have you both on. And for those of you that are jumping on the call, I do want to point out, we also have Jennifer Holloway who's joined in. Jennifer, I know I didn't invite you on as like a guest speaker, but you are, an obvious subject matter expert here. Would you do me a favor and just introduce yourself as well?
Sure. Jennifer Holloway. I'm with CIBC Bank. I have been a lender to the alarm industry, to the security industry, 30 years next month. And during that time, I have had the pleasure of working with Joe on a number of transactions. And, he's a a great, a knowledgeable, experienced resource in the space, but most importantly, has character, right? And when you're dealing with the biggest transaction that you're gonna do in your business, you need to deal with people that have the sort of the that are looking out for you. And so having good partners like that is important. But at CIBC, we lend money to this to the security industry, security, fire, video. And I also did M&A with P1 for 3 years, 27 acquisitions.
Awesome. Great. Well, thank you so much for joining the call today, Jennifer. Again, for those of you that may be new to this call, the goal for this call is for you to learn something, but also for us to learn from you. So it is, my goal is to engage you in conversation, to answer your questions. I'm hoping that you'll share your insights. Some people think that I host this call just to sell stuff to people. And hopefully, maybe you'll buy stuff at some point. But really, my goal is to learn from you. I have found that the most important things that I know, I've learned from other people. And so I really love to selfishly host this call to learn from people much more experienced and knowledgeable than I am on some of these subjects. Colby, again, so glad to have you here. And I'd like to kick things off by asking you, could you tell us a little bit about some trends you're seeing right now in security industry M&A? I know that we're hearing about a lot of activity from some of these private equity firms. Tell us, like, overall, what kind of trends are you seeing today?
Yeah, so I think we're in a really dynamic and diverse marketplace here, right? There continues to be a lot of activity, mergers and acquisitions, M&A activity within the space. I think that's continued to be strong over the last 2 years here. There's a lot of buyers out there in the marketplace. I think, those that are on, LinkedIn and see a lot of the, security systems, SDM publications, you see a lot of M&A activity on there with great companies, but there's a lot of buyers. So, there's buyers that are, national buyers that are looking to expand their national footprint. There's regional buyers that are looking to expand across state lines or into neighboring states. There's local buyers, maybe that aren't looking to acquire nationally and grow by acquisition, but they're, looking to scale and grow and, might have a local company they're looking to acquire. And there's search funds, so individuals that have financial commitment and are backed to acquire platforms and grow and build around those. And you're also seeing as well, I talked to, I think, two just last week, at, new private equity interest to enter the marketplace. So companies that are, new into the space within the last year or two that are, actively looking to grow. So you're seeing activity within all of those types of buyers, which is a good thing. I think that what you're also seeing as well with all of them, especially some of the larger acquirers, is the market is becoming, they're becoming more selective with what they acquire. There's more of a priority placed on well thought out, thorough due diligence on companies, implementing strategic integration plans for post close. So, you're not necessarily seeing companies, come in and acquire and close in 30 days. Does it happen? Sure. But, you're seeing companies be, selective and, really analyzing the acquisition. There's still I think a priority or, more of a focus from companies, looking to acquire, commercial and integration focused companies. I think still are driving a priority with, acquirers. You're seeing, probably still premium multiples placed on those types of companies. But that said, for those companies that are, more recurring revenue based, maybe residentially focused, there's buyers out there. And I can speak for ourselves within, our buyer network. There's a buyer for everybody. And
Yeah. Colby, I want to point out just something that you mentioned. You said for folks that might be kind of following along and just following their LinkedIn feed, you could be under the illusion easily that there's only like 2 to 3 companies buying companies in this business, right? Just because you see their names popping up over and over and over again, and you think, gosh, maybe that's the right buyer, and maybe it is, right? But I think one of the benefits of working with a knowledgeable broker, somebody that has a buying network or a buyer network, is that you can be you could be exposed to many other buyers too. And I think anytime you're shopping a deal, sometimes obviously we want to make sure that the numbers work, but you also want to make sure it's the right fit. It's for a lot of folks that have worked with, they've had employees that have been long tenured employees. They have a certain way of doing business. For them, a strategic regional buyer might be a better choice for them than maybe a national buyer, or maybe not, right? But could you speak to just a fit, like outside of just the dollars and cents, Colby, could you speak to, as you're guiding sellers towards prospective buyers, could you help us understand some of the things that your sellers are looking at and what they should be considering in terms of what makes a good buyer?
Yeah, I think, value's obviously going to be top of mind for everybody. It should be. You're selling what you've built your whole life, but also what you're transitioning in your portfolio is your customers. A lot of times, you have employees that are transitioning, and you want to make sure that there's a good fit there. So, I think, in addition to having everything in line and ready and prepared to sell, is, finding a buyer that's going to be the right culture fit for, your company, someone that's going to be able to take it over and integrate it well, identifying a buyer that will be a good landing spot for your employees, and then ultimately preserving the customer experience. I think a lot of people can probably relate on this call. Not everybody's in this boat, but a lot of alarm companies or commercial, whatever the company is, you operate in local small communities. And, just because you're retiring or whatever the plan might be, you still go to church on Sunday and you still go to the same restaurants, every week. And, you see people around town. So from a buyer perspective, you really want to make sure that, yes, the price is right for you and it works, but that you land with someone that's going to take care of your customers, your employees, and the business ultimately.
Yeah, unless you're just gonna escape down to Florida and you don't have to see the same folks again. I
Yeah.
know Florida's open, but it's actually a good point, Kobe, that you make. I was talking to someone in the industry recently that years ago they'd sold their business and things went south post acquisition. And he said basically to me, like, Jake, like, I still have to live in this town. Like, I know these people, right? And I go to the country club in this town and I see these people, and for him, in hindsight, realizing that that was not necessarily the best way for things to go, right? It's not that it wasn't the right buyer. It might just be that, kind of the planning and how they were going to do things post acquisition go how they expected. So it's a really, really good point about considerations with that. Now, Colby, this question comes up all the time. What are multiples at? Right. And I want to preface this with, guys, I think that question can be answered so many ways now. And I think it's an oversimplification of the values of your company. I hear these multiples thrown around all the time, and then when I ask the folks that are quoting these multiples, whether that's on net RMR or gross RMR, and how that's calculated, all of a sudden things get foggy. And they're like, I don't know, wait, I just heard this from somebody that heard it from somebody else. And, maybe I'm not an authority on the subject matter. Being an authority on the subject matter, Colby, I'm not going to ask you specifically what multiples are at right now, but I would like you to explain, when we're talking about multiples of recurring monthly revenue, the difference between $40 a month and $40 a month can be very significant, right? So can you talk to us about, kind of what's taken into consideration in these, just in these, from the perspective of recurring monthly revenue, contracted recurring monthly revenue? Could you explain the difference between those types of revenue and how they're valued?
Yeah. So I think that, there's obviously, and you touched on it, there's not a one size fits all approach to valuation. I think every company is a little bit different with how they operate. And you have, system integrators that might have a recurring revenue component to their business. And, how you look at that might be a little bit different. But I think ultimately what buyers are going to look at, especially from an RMR perspective, is margins and cash flow. So, how your RMR is priced And also, is your RMR contracted? I know that doesn't necessarily factor into the price component to it, but it factors into, what type of multiple is going to be placed on it. We can talk about, contracts later, but I think, from an RMR perspective, you want to make sure that it's priced accurately. Acquirers are going to be looking at, what is my margin when I acquire this? And there's things that factor into RMR, right? There's interactive services, you have your third party pass-throughs, your alarm.com charges, your Alula charges, any other type of video components. I think ultimately margins and cash flow is really, a main component to the evaluation on an RMR side, and as well on from an EBITDA standpoint. But
Yeah, a really good point. And I think when I talk to dealers about pass-through charges, things like alarm.com, Alula, whatever the platform provider is, sometimes they see those platform charges, those pass-through charges as kind of a negative, and certainly they can negatively impact margin if you're not pricing your services carefully. However, a lot of those pass-through charges also directly attribute to the value that subscribers see in the services. And so, while having some of those charges may impact your net RMR, it may also lower your attrition. So, can you speak to that a little bit? Like, would you tell a dealer, hey, minimize your pass-through charges as much as possible? Or would you tell them, hey, you need some of those services, so just make sure you're pricing accordingly? I think price rationalization is probably something that a lot of dealers don't think about, right? Like if we add pass-throughs that we charge more accordingly. Can you speak to, when you're looking at deals, do you think most dealers are really are they really considering those pass-through charges, how to price it, and what it might mean for the stickiness of that subscriber?
yeah, I think that, and Joe, you can piggyback off of this. I think that some are and some aren't. You have, and it's a touchy subject. You have individuals that have built great businesses and, maybe have an approach where if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And you haven't touched a customer in a while, but they're good paying, they've been with you 20 years. We run into it where dealers have their pricing structure worked out well. And when we go in and analyze, there's good margin. And we run into it too, where you have dealers that, have interactive services and video, but it's maybe not priced, the best. And they feel that, it might hurt or touch the customer. You might lose the customer, should you alter price, their RMR price on things. So it gets sticky, but from an acquisition standpoint, if there's not a lot of margin there for an acquirer, it's going to ultimately hurt value. Joe, I don't know if you want to add to that.
No, I think you're right. I mean, cash is still king. And the bottom line is, if you're not pricing your recurring services to market, then it's going to lower your gross margin just on the recurring side. So, again, I think, the question was, do you limit the interactive services, Jake? No, you're right. They stick. It's the technology of the day, and you have to compete.
Sure.
So you don't want to do that. You just have to make sure that it's priced appropriately. And then there's other aspects of anything in a portfolio. So it's not just interactive. It's really, when we look at a company, we look at really preparing a seller, or if we're working with a buyer, we really drill down on all the revenue elements of a company, whatever they are: recurring, sales, service, install. And we look at each aspect of that and what the margin contribution is to the business,
Yeah.
because that's what's ultimately critical. So, you could have a great business, but you could have 25% of your business that's under market, like it's still 1995. Okay. So what happens is that 1995 is way below market. It's not driving a lot of cash out. And so that would be an element where a buyer could say, well, that's going to decrease my value proposition to the seller.
Yeah. I think that with most pass-through charges, whether it's your cellular, your interactive services, access control, whatever those services are that you're adding to the account, most of those software charges, those platform charges, they're predictable. Not only are they predictable, but it's easy for you to do the math on it. But where I see a lot of systems integrators get a little confused, or maybe not as diligent in, kind of managing their costs, or calculating their costs, is with contracted service revenue, right? And so, a lot of times you have, it's easy to know, hey, my alarm.com pass through is this. But for a lot of systems integrators that don't bill for service, as an example, right? Anytime we go out to a customer to fix their system, to change a battery, whatever the case might be, to rehang a door contact, we're not charging for it. The savviest systems integrators that I know, they still track what would be billable service so that they can calculate what that service is actually costing them. Any words of caution to systems integrators that may be on the call, either on the sell side of a transaction or on the buy side of a transaction, that aren't realizing, hey, how much of this service has been given away historically? And when I try to charge Miss Jones for a service call, is she going to flip out? Any guidance that you might provide to buyers or sellers as it relates to contracted service revenue?
I think that, so I can probably use it from a commercial fire standpoint. It's a little bit different, but playing into the valuation on, inspections, right? Is a lot of times acquiring companies will take a look at, the inspection revenue, whether it's contracted or not. And the way they'll value it is essentially, net, and they'll take their costs. So what is either the, current seller's costs to perform those inspections, or what are my costs going to be to perform the inspections, against what the customer's paying you annually or semi-annually, and, really net that number down to work off of, like, what is my profit. And, with those, sometimes we see companies that are priced well and you have good margin. And then other times companies that are, probably losing money, or maybe not making, netting zero. So I think getting an understanding, especially if you're getting ready to go to market, Joe and I can help with this, advisors in the industry can help with this, is, getting an understanding of your margins and pricing structure.
Yeah. And I think this is one of the benefits of preparing your company for a sale, whether you're planning to sell or not, going through that due diligence process, going through, like, the books with a fine-tooth comb, working with somebody that understands what a potential buyer or a banker is going to look at when evaluating your business, is so important, right? Because a lot of times what I find is that folks wait to the very end. In the worst scenarios, I have found, you know, either the adult children or the widow, a lot of times, of an owner that was not prepared, did not have their books in order, had not really considered any of these things, and they weren't prepared for it. So if you're on a call and you're saying, like, hey, I'm not looking to sell my company, like, that's not the goal, it's not the near term plan. Um, I would encourage you to still evaluate your company as if you were planning to sell it tomorrow, because who knows? We just don't know what tomorrow brings. And so, I would encourage you to connect with someone on that. Now, we've talked about RMR. We've talked about margin on RMR. We've talked a little bit about contracted service revenue, which I think is a really great conversation for another call that we can dig deep into, how to appropriately price service contracts and make them a profitable component of your business. But a couple years ago, I was at the Barnes Buchanan conference, and Michael Barnes was talking about these darling companies, these companies that had recurring monthly revenue here, and they had really strong project revenue, a very profitable project revenue, consistent, predictable business that they were doing there. And when you're working with a seller, or on the sell side, if you're working with a seller or a buyer, right, and you're looking at a business that has recurring monthly revenue and strong project revenue, How do you kind of work with them to price that business, and how does the project revenue factor in versus just the contracted recurring monthly revenue?
Yeah, so I typically from a valuation standpoint and how you're going to analyze it is you're looking at the business, a little bit more holistically. So you're all of that factors in, but you're probably taking probably more of a look at, what is the business's net income or EBITDA, depending if it's a, cash business or not. But, project revenue is huge. And, you've probably heard Mike talk about this is, and for uh, integration acquirers, companies looking to acquire integration companies or commercially focused companies, the project revenue analysis has become a big part of the process, analyzing to put an offer together and during due diligence. And so, really, on that front, from a project revenue standpoint, companies are going to take a look at, take a dated look back, 3 years financials, and what they're going to be looking for is, profitable, repeatable, and consistent project revenue. They if you have 2 years that were not great, and then 1 year, if it's more of like a roller coaster, is probably gonna it's not terrible, but it's probably gonna cause some questions. And then, in addition to that, from a recurring revenue standpoint, they're gonna factor in, more contracted, predictable revenue and how that plays into the bottom line. It ultimately kind of factors into, how is it going to integrate into acquirer's business. And Joe and I on the sell side, working with sellers, will go in and break that out, right? So there's project revenue, we'll break out, service versus inspection revenue and tie into, new service revenue versus existing service. So you could really dive into the weeds of it, but it's an important part of the valuation process from both sides.
Yeah, this is so often I talk to systems integrators that they've been at it for 10, 20, 30, 40 years, and they have focused primarily on that project revenue and have done what I would consider to be maybe a poor job on building recurring monthly revenue. When we talk about predictability of revenue, if you were to tell a systems integrator today what to focus on, would you tell them to put an equal or more of a focus on that contracted recurring monthly revenue versus those projects?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think having a good mix is helpful. I think, having diversification in your revenue streams is always going to play well to an acquirer. I think that's a plus and a bonus. So don't focus necessarily. And obviously, I'm, well aware everyone's business is a little bit different and specific towards a customer, but diversity in your revenue streams is huge. I think on the project revenue side, maybe don't be too top heavy, right? Don't have it be too spread out, maybe not be reliant on one big job each year where that's going to kind of create a roller coaster. So from a project revenue side, have it spread out. Obviously relationships are key when it comes to that. Joe, I don't know if you have anything else to add, but I think the biggest thing we preach, from that is diversity in revenue streams for sure.
And again, we're dealing with a client right now that, is not a huge regional player, but they're a seller, right? And then you find out that they've got really strong service revenue, install revenue, they have project revenue, and it's not one significant client that's providing it. So, and they have contracted service revenues, so they have predictable, consistent drivers in their business that become very attractive to a buyer that's looking for a platform, even if it's a smaller company or as a fold-in or tuck-in, Jake.
Yeah, so I just want to pull out and put in bold here something that you've said, Joe. You talked about it not being tied to, one significant client. Guys, I have seen systems integrators build their company around one significant client. And and when that client goes away, their business is no more really. All of a sudden they're going to search for more business. And fair to say, Colby, that if your eggs are all in one basket, that a buyer is going to see that as, at risk revenue.
Yeah, definitely, and I think it'll be analyzed a little bit. They'll analyze it differently. Back in our alarm connections days, we were looking at a business, and this ties back a little bit to more RMR focused, but we were analyzing, looking at a business that had a little over $100,000 in RMR, and it had 70% of the RMR was tied to an HOA, and it was under one contract. And you can dive into the specifics of that, but so much was reliant on that one customer. And so I think it goes back to what Joe said and I said, diversity helps and spreading it out helps. Well, it won't kill a deal, but there's a risk factor. And I think with a lot of the acquirers in the market now, a lot of them have private equity backing or bank backing, and some of them have their own cash. But those that are backed, and yeah, I think Jennifer could probably attest to this too, is they're going to do their own analysis and modeling, and that is for sure going to come up in those conversations.
Yeah. So, I talk about some of these things that might come up in the conversations, deal killers, so to speak. Can you speak to some of the most frequent deal killers that you see, or if not a deal killer, something that's going to throw a wrench in the deal negotiations consistently?
Yeah, so I think from a sell side perspective, it's a little bit of a trickle down effect, but ultimately where we see deals get killed or sellers get caught off guard is not being prepared coming into the process. See, getting a true understanding of where value might land. What, and we talked about this earlier, what type of buyers are out there for your business and how are they going to assess your business? Having your financials, your attrition, your central station data all in line so that you're knowledgeable and prepared when you're ready to go to market. So what we see happen, at least on our end, with Monachino partners, is deals can get killed or sellers can get caught off guard, however it might be, is, if they're not really aware of where value is going to land, if they don't have a true read on their attrition, that is a key analysis point. Contracts are huge. So, do you need to do a full contract review before you go to market? Yes. And making sure that, the terms and conditions in those are assignable and transferable to an acquirer. These are all things you can do to get prepared. Something we've also seen kill a deal or delay a deal big time is having an understanding of, any debt or liens, any legal or tax liabilities that are present. Most people acquiring, especially if you have bank backing or private equity backing, will require it to be, liens to be clear and free. So those are all things you can cover before you go to market. But those are things we've seen also delay or kill deals.
Yeah, I think that's such an important piece of this. The contract one is one. This one kind of makes me laugh sometimes because I have seen scenarios where dealers have copied somebody else's contract and they changed the name up at the top and they put their information on it, but they didn't realize that throughout the rest of the agreement, it actually references the other company specifically that they stole this contract from. And um it's funny because as an industry we're so anti DIY, although we have so many DIY attorneys in this business that will want to do their own contracts or in some cases take contracts from other folks. you know is there some place, is there a resource? Generally, we refer folks over to get a contract from Ken Kirschenbaum. I think there's a couple other folks in the business, but if somebody wanted to make sure that they had an assignable, saleable, contract, is there somebody that you would recommend that could provide them with such a contract?
Yeah, I think it's a good point too, just to kind of tie. I can answer it two part. I think it ties into getting prepared to go to market. A lot of people on the call probably are, but you use your own representation, obviously, but getting acclimated with an industry attorney. Joe and I are not attorneys, but getting acclimated with an industry attorney, especially if you're going to be getting ready to sell, can be very helpful. From a contract standpoint, Ken is great. His contracts are clean and they work well transitioning during a sale. We have a couple other legal partners that we reference on our website as well, that can be helpful and have years of industry experience, either writing contracts, customer contracts, or, any M&A legal help as well.
Yeah, I would just point out that, the temperament of your attorney can really impact, I think, how deals go sometimes. If your attorney does not have industry experience or does not have the right temperament, you could find that, a deal gets bogged down in legal or blown up in legal. Um, you know, do you, is there from a M&A side of things, are there some specific groups that you recommend that you work with regularly on the M&A side?
John Barlow with Mitchell Barlow and Mansfield. Yeah, they're a West Coast company, but work all over the country. John is well tempered, does a great job analyzing deals. He looks out well for his clients. We've been on a couple deals with Ken as well. But I echo your point. Mark Katz is another fantastic industry attorney, very knowledgeable, has a great team. And I think, those guys can be very, very helpful. They can be as helpful as you want them to be, but, very helpful when you come down to, finalizing a deal, working through a asset purchase agreement for sure.
Guys, a lot of what we've been discussing so far, we've been kind of talking about it from the perspective of a seller, right? But there may be some folks in the call that are looking at buying a company. Just look at the very same advice from the buyer side perspective, right? Because all of these things that a seller should be considering, all things that you should be considering as a buyer too, right? Sometimes on these transactions where the buyer does not have a lot of experience, the deal goes through and doesn't get blown up. And you could end up at the end closing on a deal, and that was the goal. But because you didn't have knowledgeable representation on your side as a buyer, you could end up buying kind of a mess. Colby, are you willing to speak to, any kind of words of caution for folks that are looking to buy accounts that they should really be careful and watch out for?
Yeah, I think that, it always benefits whether you work with somebody as a broker or you hire someone as a consultant to work through thorough due diligence. There's a lot to analyze. I think that you might hear it, especially in account sales, but just in general is, let's move or, let's get a deal done and, let's close this in 30 days or 60 days. And, my words of caution, especially if you're looking to get in the acquisition market, you haven't, or maybe you've done a small sale, is, you know, don't rush the process, do thorough due diligence. That we can help with that, obviously, but, ensure that what you're buying is qualified and that your investment is going to be protected, because ultimately, you're buying something that's going to need a yield of return for you. And the goal would be obviously to grow it and build around it. But, the last thing you want to happen is you overpay for something or you buy accounts that, maybe aren't performing as well as they were marketed. So, protecting your investment is key, and you can do that through validating the financial analysis and accounts and all that during due diligence. So perform thorough due diligence is my main piece of recommendation, and, take your time.
So, we talked about kind of polishing your company up for a sale, getting everything buttoned up, prepared, making sure that your pricing is rational, making sure that your margins are there, making sure that your contracts are in place. Um, but on the buy side of things, do you think that sometimes there are opportunities to buy a company where the accounts may not be, Joe talks about not being at market prices, right? And the ability to take these 1995 accounts and bump them up in price. Do you think that there are some diamonds in the rough out there where, if you're a buyer, you could buy one of these companies and then post transaction kind of turn things around and find some additional value in the account base?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and I think Joe can speak to it well, with his past, but you're always going to need to look at how are you going to scale and grow what you're acquiring. And, sometimes that falls into you're acquiring something that needs a little bit of work. Um, might need contract cleanup, but you're acquiring accounts that might have low margin, but there's, strategy to that. Obviously, you want to acquire it well and transition it, but there's always opportunities to go out and there's price increase opportunities. It's an opportunity to get in front of the customer and introduce yourself as the new local company. A lot of times that can help with, getting contracts re-signed, but there's always, potential to increase the value of your investment. And sometimes that falls in with portfolios that need a little bit of cleanup. Joe, I don't know if you have anything to add.
No, I mean, one of your best clientele is your own customer, Jake, right? So,
Sure.
your ability to go out even at that side and start meeting with customers you've acquired that are at a lower margin, start introducing interactive services and upgrading them. There's all kinds of opportunities, right? And same thing with price increases. I think the value proposition, I think Colby said it. I mean, again, regardless of the acquisition, it's got to be accretive to the buyer, right? So, and it has to be scalable for the buyer. You're not buying a static pool of accounts that's just going to attrit over the years. And we represent buyers. So,
Sure.
however it's valued, whether it's an integrator or whether it's more of an RMR play, the bottom line, again, it's margins, cash flow, and scalability.
Yeah.
And the higher the value kind of fits all of those boxes because it has to be accretive and they're going to look for a return on their investment and they're going to see how it all integrates into their current operations.
So let's talk about that. Let's talk about post-acquisition integration. What does the perfect post-acquisition integration look like?
Yeah, I think that, and I can speak to how, Joe and I, manage it is I think it, part of an integration plan is worked out during due diligence, and there's things, and not all acquirers take this approach, but, there's things that take place post close that require attention. You'll have, in some cases, not all cases, a central station conversion. You're going to need to transfer ownership of, your third party services, alarm.com, for example. There's a billing conversion and an accounting conversion that needs to take place, customer communications, all of that. There's, employee transition integration, the CRM integration. I can keep going, but there's a lot that takes place after a deal closes that, it needs to be organized in order to, successfully transition. And ultimately, you're preserving the customer experience too. You want to prevent as much or as little attrition as possible. So I think, a smooth transition, can really be executed well is if it's organized and thought out and included as part of the due diligence process so that when you close, you have a clear plan of action. And there's advisors that can help with that. But there's also, as you're organizing and transitioning your team, you can set up a transition team from people that are on the acquiring company and people that are in the buying company, and they can work together. So I think having a well thought out plan, a lot of those transitions can be complex, billing for sure. Having good relationships, I'll add to this a little bit, with your vendor partners and your central station partners. I know there's a couple central station people here on the call. They can be very helpful with that transition as well.
Or not, or in some cases, not so helpful. We've
Exactly.
seen, we've heard some horror stories out there, when dealers say, hey, we're looking to move our accounts from one central station to another. And all of a sudden it's like total communication shutdown, or, they're throwing up barriers because they don't want to lose the accounts.
Right.
Do you recommend as it relates to that? So post acquisition, whether you're on the buy side or the sell side of things. Do you recommend that those accounts be immediately transferred over to the acquirer's central station? Do you recommend some kind of transition period? Because, I think it's worth noting that as an industry, we really benefit from all of these incredible competitive scaled central stations that if we're honest, they do most of the work on a daily basis, right? They're the ones that are, calling your subscribers and touching those subscribers often more often than our systems integrators. So any advice that you would give to either sellers or buyers on kind of how to handle that central station transition?
Yeah, I think every buyer handles it a little bit differently, and it depends on the type of buyer and where they monitor. But I think getting an understanding of, we evaluate and we ask for it when we do due diligence, but evaluate your agreement, current agreement, master agreement with wherever you're monitored, your central station agreement, and just get a read on what are the terms potentially on if you were to move or not to move. I think that if and every acquisition's different. Some people like to move immediately, some don't. It is a process, and it doesn't always hurt to at least keep the accounts where they are, at least for the transition period. I mean,
Yeah.
ultimately, you want to try to prevent as much attrition as possible, but it's a tricky question to answer just because I think every buyer handles it differently.
Sure. Now, you bring up a good point about that, a period of time to transition. Oftentimes these purchase and sell agreements, they have a guarantee period during which, the seller could be pretty severely penalized should some of those accounts attrit, whether that's through just natural attrition or, you know, hopefully you wouldn't see poor service, you wouldn't see rate hikes, you wouldn't see a change to like an inferior central station that's providing a lower quality of service. Anything that when you're working with a seller, what guidance do you give them on making sure that they get back the biggest piece of that holdback as possible? How do you help them ensure that? Because that's oftentimes that's a substantial. What is it? Typically about 10% of the transaction? I know it might vary, but would you say about 10% on average?
Yeah, we've seen 10 to 20. 20 is high. That's typically if it's, portfolio that needs a little bit of hand holding and heavy transition. 10 to 15% is typically where, we've seen ours land.
And how do you help sellers make sure that, they're gonna get as big of a piece of that back as possible?
Yeah, I think it two-part. Every seller has different preferences and how they want to handle post-close activities themselves. I think helping transition the business will give them more control over preventing possible areas of attrition. The other part would be tying it back to kind of our industry attorney discussion is when you're working through finalizing a deal, ensuring that the attorney you work with has provisions in there that exclude the seller from being held accountable for certain areas of attrition that might be out of their control, is another component. But I think providing some help at least 6 months, a lot of our clients will help transition to some capacity for the full year, always helps.
Yeah, I mean, it's, oftentimes we see dealers that, by the time they're ready to sell, they want to take the money and run, right? Like they're like, like, but I was gonna hang on to this as long as I could hang on to it, but now I'm burnt out, I'm frustrated, I'm ready to go. I don't want to do this anymore. But I guess what I'm taking from what you're saying here, the advice that you're giving, Colby, is that if you want the biggest piece of that holdback, having a very collaborative relationship post transaction, helping kind of smooth over any issues with customers. That's the best practice. Yeah.
Yes, and in most cases, I think that's where we see people yield the most return when they've been provided assistance on the transition.
Awesome. Guys, I want to open it up to questions real quick, rapid fire questions. It's a 10-second question, a 10-second answer. Does anybody have a quick question?
I do. So I'm looking at a couple small deals, maybe a couple hundred accounts, and both of them are most likely going to be seller financed. And these are like installers that, are just ready to kind of retire. And I hear what you're saying. And I think the advice that you gave is excellent for maybe larger acquisitions. I'm just kind of worried a little bit about, having too extraneous of a process if they're seller financed. And I guess, there is some, I think, benefit to speed and convenience and trying to get a deal wrapped up sooner than being too arduous. Obviously there's a balance there, but for a small deal or seller financed, do you have any like key formulas or advice on that, as well as if you're looking at RMR, what would be like a really good rate that you think would be a deal on, like 20x, 25, 30?
We'll have Colby answer that. I want to just add perspective. It only takes one account to go bad for you to end up in court, right? So like you could have, if you buy one bad account and that contract does not protect you, I have seen all kinds of horror stories with really serious claims from subscribers. That's a whole nother call here. But I just want to add the perspective, Kirk, that it only takes one. So I know a lot of times when we see these, we see these small deals, we say, hey, we could just tuck this in and not look at it. Sometimes reputable, experienced buyers don't even engage in those types of deals because they know they still have to go through due diligence. They still have to check all the boxes. I'm going to turn it over to the experts on it, but I just wanted to add one layman's perspective on that. So I'll turn it over to you, Colby, to add some insights there.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think, and we see seller financed opportunities as well, or excuse me, owner financed. I would say with those, a lot of it's, I talked about this earlier. A lot of it's relationship driven too, a little bit. So pending whatever relationships you have with the individual selling that you're acquiring from, I would just advise on the financing side is just ensure that you're protected as well, so that you don't put yourself in a position where you end up getting, for lack of better words, burned. I would say seller financing, just make sure you're protected yourself. I think that, and I'll echo Jake, I think that ultimately as the buyer, it's up to you on how you want to acquire whatever it is you're acquiring. It's your business, your choice. But I always would say do due diligence. You can be as selective with that as you want, but I think being protected and knowing what you're acquiring at the end of the day just helps from a longevity standpoint.
I would add, anyone thinking of doing a small deal like that, you still need to know that a customer has a contract. You still need to know that they've paid their bills and aging. You still need to look at central station reporting and signal activity to make sure that what you're buying is actually signaling at the central station. Even if it's all alarm.com, you're able to get into alarm.com, pull a trouble report, and say, oh my God, I'm buying 100 accounts and 3 of them aren't even working. So that kind of diligence is still required, even on a small deal. And I think that's what Colby's saying. Regardless, what you don't want to be caught for is you're buying something and then you're paying for it over a 3 or 4 year period, and you're caught paying the full boat, and you don't have the accounts. Or the accounts to tread.
And making sure that you're protected, because I've heard more than one scenario where a small seller might sell those accounts more than once, and you don't realize you've paid out the money, or even if it's just the down payment, this deal's too good to pass up. Gosh, all I got to do is put down $25,000 to buy 200 accounts, I'm in. But he sold those 200 accounts 2-3 times, and he already sold them to somebody else as well. So be cautious on that. I would also add that on really small deals, Kirk, sometimes we see some of our dealers, they'll work out a deal where they'll go out and perfect those accounts. They'll do a site visit, they'll sign a new contract, and they'll pay like a commission on each of those deals. but it gives them an opportunity to just make sure everything's done, set up online, the customer's happy, and minimizes their risk. That's not something you can do when you buy 1,000 accounts or 5,000 accounts, but a couple hundred accounts, gosh, you could probably assign a tech to go do that over a couple of months, 2, 3 months, and button them up. I want to go to Stevie G real quick, and then we're going to call it, guys. So, Stevie, what's the question?
Hi, Colby, Joe. Thank you so very much for your time today. Very informative. I just had a quick question. You guys had spoken about the margins and so forth like that, and you were referencing industry standards and so forth like that. What are you guys seeing from an install slash service perspective on margins? What are you guys looking for? What is a healthy margin, or what are you guys consider the industry standards? And then on the RMR component, on that same point, what are you guys looking for? What do you consider the industry standards on margins on that type of business?
I hate to say it, it depends, but I would say that if you're looking at just the recurring revenue side with integrated services, if you're above, 70 some odd percent, I mean, this is before you net out pass-throughs, right? 72, 73%, then your monitoring is cash flowing well. And, in terms of installation and service, I mean, a lot of this has to do with how it's priced, what your billing is, but 30, 40% gross margins, 50% gross margins on service.
Gosh, sometimes I regret ever getting in the distribution business, I tell you.
Yeah. But I mean, these are gross margins. You got to remember, you got G&A, you got associated G&A associated with all that gross margin. All I'm saying is, if it's cash flowing on those kinds of bases, then it's cash flowing down to the bottom line. So if you're looking at EBITDA of, let's say 28, 30, 32% EBITDA, maybe slightly greater on the top line revenues before adjusted EBITDA, Steve, right? Then, that's probably a pretty strong cash flowing business. So it's, I know I just threw out a bunch of numbers, but, the more cash you can drive to the bottom line, even on an adjusted basis, the stronger the value is going to be to a buyer. Or if you are buying, the stronger the value to the bottom line is going to add more value to the purchase, because it has to be accretive for Steve in terms of cash flow. So, and that's, the bottom line is, that's why you have to prepare on either side to really look at people's balance sheets and P&L and make sure that you can do, especially in fires, in commercial fire and security and integrators, you can do a really good quality of earnings test on the company.
Guys, one other quick note on this. And, Joe's talking about margin. Steve's asking about what the margin should be. If there's one advice that I could give you today, go and look for profit leakage on your company. Look for those accounts to where you're sending out service techs repeatedly and you're not charging them enough for those service contracts. Audit your central station bill. Make sure you're not paying for accounts that canceled a year ago. Make sure that you're not keeping accounts on the books that have canceled or haven't been paying you. Clean those things up, because margins you can adjust. You have the opportunity with every transaction that you do. You can change your pricing. That's the beauty of it, right? And you can do blanket pricing adjustments as well. But some of the things that we see a lot of dealers miss the boat on is just cleaning up some of those profit leakages. So stay on top of that. I want to thank Joe and Colby. Thank you so much for joining the call today. I really appreciate your insights and your expertise. Guys, we have this call every Friday at 11 a.m. Next week, it's 4th of July, so I won't be on, but I wish all of you a happy Independence Day. We will be back online on 7/11. So I'm looking forward to our call on 7/11. And again, just want to thank Joe and Colby for joining us, and all of you for joining us. If you didn't have your question answered, Colby and Joe's contact information is there in the chat, so feel free to send them a note. For those of you that do business with us today, I want to thank you. We appreciate the opportunity to support you. for those of you that don't do business with us today, I want to invite you to reach out to me. I'd love the opportunity to support you as your distributor. We'd love to print your logo on your products that you prefer, because you ought to have it on there. You've worked very hard for your name and reputation, and we take a lot of pride in putting it front and center where it belongs. But whether you do business with us or not, you're always welcome on this call. Thank you for being here, and we'll see all of you again in 2 weeks. Thanks so much.